QuickBooks Pro Plus Desktop 2022 Vendor Center. Get ready because we bookkeeping pros are moving up the hilltop with QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2022. Here we are in our free QuickBooks sample file, that being the sample rock castle construction. We're going to go through the standard process. Once we open up the company file, we have nothing open at this point in time. I'll typically then go to the open windows so I can view the open windows, go into the view drop-down open windows list. There's our open windows, nothing in it at this point. I'll typically give me some more space by pulling this down. Then we'll put some open windows in this gray area, starting with the home page by going to the company drop down home page. It's not fully maximized. I can move it around in this gray area. In other words, I'm going to maximize it. I'll typically then open up the major financial statements, that being the balance sheet and the income statement, because everything I do, I want to think about how it relates to those major financial statements and then any other supplemental reports that might be applicable as well. Reports drop down. Company and financial. I typically open up the balance sheet first. So I'm going to go to the balance sheet standard report. There it is. We're going to keep the date where it's at. Then I'm going to open up another report, noting that I have two things now open that I can toggle back and forth from in the open windows. Reports drop down, company and financial, P&L, profit and loss, otherwise known as the income statement. I'm going to change the starting date to January here and refresh the report. So there's our typical items that we'll have open. I then want to go back to the home page. In a prior presentation, we discussed the flows in terms of the vendor section or the accounts payable or purchases, you might hear it called, customer or sales or revenue section, employee or payroll section. We then went into more detail on the vendor section, thinking about the flows. Now we want to go into the vendor center, which you can do by clicking this vendor item, or you can hit the drop down up top in the vendor area in the vendor drop down to go to the vendor center. So first, however, let's first think why we need to go to an added vendor center. Note that most of the forms that you would use for the normal data input within the vendor section would be here, as we saw last time, including a check or a transfer out of the bank account, money going out to pay someone else. Remember that vendors represent who we're paying. We can think of ourselves as a vendor as well because we're buying stuff. We are buying stuff and we're selling stuff. But with regards to QuickBooks, when we're using QuickBooks, vendors represent the people that we're buying stuff from, goods, services, inventory that we're buying from other people. And so keep the directionality correct. Money, in essence, at the end of the day, is going to be going out when we're dealing with the vendors. We could do so by paying directly with a check or transfer, or we can have it go through the accounts payable process by entering then a bill, which we can do from the front page here and or through the drop downs up top in the vendor section. Now we're going to have an added level that we want for detail to track our vendors, because we might in a future point want to know how much we paid to a particular vendor. And for that, we could then go to the vendor center, or would somehow have to break out the information by vendor. We also might want to know, if we're doing accounts payable, entering the bills, paying them later, who we owe money to, which means we're going to have more information. One place we can go there to get that would be the vendor center. To get a better idea of that, let's first think about this with regards to the reports, the financial statements, first looking at the balance sheet report. If we were to enter a bill and owe money to somebody, we'd have a liability down here called accounts payable, $26,636 in this case. We'd need more detail about that particular account, the information not broken out by date of activity, as we could get if we just double click on this, get in the general ledger in essence, or transaction detail, but by who we owe the money to. We could do that with a report. We can also look at the vendor center. Let's consider the report real quick. This will be a supplemental report for the vendors. We're going to hit the drop down. We're going to go down to the vendors and payables. I want to look at the vendor balance. Let's look at the vendor balance summary. So here's the vendor balance summary. It adds up to the $26,636 at the end of the report. That $26,636, if I go back to the balance sheet, ties out then to that balance sheet amount. So now we know who we owe the money to. These are going to be the particular vendors, and that's that added level of detail. We can call this a subledger type of account that kind of supports the amount on the financial statement, breaking it out with this added level of detail by vendor. We also might want to know, for example, if I go to the profit and loss report, in essence, the income statement, all the expense items we have down below represent, in essence, payments that went out, either going through the accounts payable or going out directly in the form of a decrease to the checking account directly, such as a check or with a transfer. So these are also items that often are going to be vendors. We might simply want to know how much we paid these people, not by category as it's listed here in terms of what we paid them for, utility, phone bill, and so on, but by vendor, which would be like the AT&T for the phone bill and Edison or something for the electricity and so on. So to do that, we can then get some more detail on that if we go back to the home page. So if I go to the vendor center either here, or I often go to the drop down and go to the vendor center, because that drop down is always there even if you're not on the home page. So it's often good to kind of get used to the drop down so that you can navigate a little bit more easily. Then you could pull this tab here onto the right if you so choose. You can also minimize this tab up top to give you a little bit more space. So if we look at the vendor center, then we've got the vendors on the left-hand side. We've got the transactions on the right-hand side. Let's first consider the vendors, probably the most common way you'll take a look at the vendor center. If you had a question about a particular vendor and you're saying, hey, I would like to know how much we owe that particular vendor, and or, for example, possibly that vendor asks you a question. It says, have you paid this particular item, or so on and so forth. We then might be looking up in the vendor section. We could do so by typing in who we want to look up. Like if we're going to look up this one, East Bayshore, we could start typing that in and do our search here, and then we can basically search in that form. I'm going to close this back out. It could be in alphabetical order, of course, so we can sort our data in that way. We can also filter our data with the drop down. So we could say we want all vendors. That would include vendors that we have created or made inactive. You might make a vendor inactive if you're saying, I'm no longer doing business with this vendor. I can't delete them because I have business done with them in the past, but we can make them inactive so I don't clutter my vendor list. We can look at the active vendors. That's generally the default. We can look at the vendors with balances. Now you've got your list of vendors here that only show the ones that have an outstanding balance related to them. You also have the other filter or custom filter option as well. And you can search by items here and for, and then you can have the fields, which would be the name field, the address field, the phone field, the vendor name, and so on, which can help you further sort down your filter options for advanced sorting. When you go into a particular vendor, then you've got your tabs on the right-hand side. So you're going to have your information up top with the vendor information. You got your transactions tabs, your contacts tabs, your to-dos, your notes, and then your sending of the emails. A lot of this information will be populated when you create, say, a new vendor, which you can do from the vendor center. You can hit the drop down and say new vendor. I won't actually add the vendor, but you can see the input field for it. You can also add vendors as you go, which is probably the more common way that people will add normal vendors, like day-to-day types of vendors for bills that they are paying. Because remember, when you're looking at a vendor, then you may not need all the information depending on the type of vendor. In other words, if I'm paying the phone bill or I'm paying the utility bill, really all I really want is the name so that I can sort by the name and possibly determine how much I owe or how much I have paid to that particular vendor. Now, there could be some vendors, however, that we do a lot of business with, such as people we buy inventory from, in which case I might want a lot more information, like the company name, the contact information, the address, and so on and so forth. You also have the payment settings, the tax settings, the account settings, and the additional information. So we'll probably go through this in a bit more detail in future presentations. But once you set up the vendors, then that's going to be in part what sets up this information up top. You can also create the new vendors when you make fields for vendors, such as bills, such as checks, and you can basically add those as you go. When you use bank feeds, you'll often be in a situation where you will want to create the vendors as you go, as well as you're paying people and the bank feeds come into the system. You need to be careful making sure that you set up the vendors properly in that case, because oftentimes the bank feed doesn't have the ideal information to see which vendor you're using, although it could have a memo. And so you do want to include the vendors so that you can track that information and see how much you have paid to a particular vendor. So then, of course, we got the transaction detail. We've got the bill payment here. The bill represents something that's going to be an increase in the accounts payable. Bill payment means the accounts payable is going down. We might pay with simply a check. If we pay with a check, that means it went straight out of the checking account and we did not then decrease or increase the accounts payable and then take it out of the accounts payable. We just paid it straight out of cash and didn't go through the liability account of accounts payable. Now, you could edit a particular vendor by double-clicking on the vendor, and that'll get you back into our data input field, so you can see the data input in this format. Closing this back out with the X up top. Don't hit this X, but this X below, or else you will close the program. You also have your attachment items here, so if you wanted to attach something for this particular vendor, possibly, an image of their place or something like that, or a map quest of, how to find them or something like that. Or if you had bills or things that you want to attach to that particular vendor, you also have the edit option here, which will take you also into that same editing field as we saw when we double clicked on the vendor name. So then you got your detail in terms of the transactions. If you double click on the transactions, that will drill down into the transaction so that you could see the detail of it, taking us to the form, in this case, that form being a check. So you can see the detail of the check. We'll talk more about these forms, the checks and the bills, in future presentations. I closed it out by clicking the X then up top. The second tab in your vendor section in the vendor center will be the transactions. Common transactions, as we saw in the cycle in the vendor section, could be the purchase orders, which probably wouldn't be there unless you're in a larger type of company. You got the items that have been received, which in essence will generally be inventory items. Bills then are going to be those types of transactions that will be for increases to accounts payable. So when you see a bill for QuickBooks, that means a bill to us. You might say, well, I send out bills to other people, but when you send out the bill for QuickBooks, you got to see which side of the table you're on with regards to the terminology in QuickBooks. For QuickBooks, when you send out bill to somebody else, you're sending an invoice. So an invoice for QuickBooks means it's outgoing. You're billing someone else. You're sending out a bill to QuickBooks means we're receiving a bill from someone else that we will then have to pay. And more specifically, the bill from QuickBooks means we're increasing accounts payable and not paying it directly at this point. And then we got the pay bills. That means we're writing a check or doing some other form of payment, whether that be check, credit card, or a decrease to the checking account with a transfer that's paying off the bill specifically. So it's still kind of a decrease to the checking account, in essence a check, but specifically decreasing an accounts payable account. The checks represent checks that went out that are not paying off accounts payable, meaning we're paying off, in essence, the bill that we got directly. So if we got a bill from the phone company, I'm not entering the bill, which would increase accounts payable, but rather simply paying it right at that point in time, decreasing the checking account at that point in time, and entering the related expense at that point instead of increasing the accounts payable. Credit card activity as well, and then the sales tax payments that would be in place as well, so that you could then sort these transactions. If I go to the bills, for example, you have your filter options, including the open bills. So these are bills that basically need to be paid. And then we've got the overdue bills. You can also use your date filters as well. Back to the vendor section. So this is a common place that you're going to go to answer questions about particular vendors and or see how much you've paid particular vendors and see the open balances as well. And a lot of times, if you're working in a larger company that has a lot of accounts payable transactions, you'll spend a lot of time here, and you possibly will spend a lot of time going to the balance sheet, working with your payable account, as well as the section in terms of your subsidiary report with your vendor balance summary and vendor balance detailed reports. We'll take a closer look at the reports in future presentations, and then in future presentations, I'm going back to the home tab. We will then go through the vendor section and look at each of these forms to see what these forms would do, what the impact will be on the financial statements, and when you would use them.